Hello, everyone. This time that I'm joining you, I wanted to recap a discussion we had way back in February 2020 with the Being a Fan of Disney class, with a few updates as far as things that the Walt Disney Company has acquired, and some of the newer acquisitions, but also newer forms of news and items of news that have come out. So this discussion focuses on the Disney acquisition, specifically ABC and ESPN, Pixar, Marvel, Star Wars, and Fox. And so we'll go ahead and get started. Here are um, the Disney acquisitions, and we'll get to Fox in a little bit. But it started in 1985 with ABC, ESPN, and in 1985, ABC was purchased by Capital Cities Communications for $3.5 billion. And then in 1996, Capital Cities ABC was purchased by Disney for $19 billion. And that's that part of that acquisition. Disney assumed stake in ESPN. It was 8% at the time. This, in my view, is probably, I think, the most important acquisition that the company made, from a fan perspective and from a business perspective. From a fan perspective, it brought in a lot of different fans, from people who maybe were older and felt like they didn't watch Disney content anymore, bringing in ABC and bringing in ESPN brought back a lot of people who may be older and no longer were watching some of the animated or the live action content that Disney was producing at that time. So then that also, from a business perspective, it helped bring in a lot of revenue. It really grew the reach that the Walt Disney Company had, and it brought in a lot of revenue from different sources that the company was able to spend and put in different areas, in the parks, in content creation. And in a little bit, we'll talk about ESPN Wide World of Sports and the impact that has had on the Walt Disney Company, including the rumors that maybe Disney at some point would actually sell off ESPN or sell off parts of ESPN or ABC. But I think this is a very, very important acquisition that the Walt Disney Company made. We jump forward to 2006 and the story of Pixar. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But the titles, beginning with Toy Story through The Incredibles, were released under an agreement with Disney. In 2006, Disney, under CEO Bob Iger, purchased Pixar for $7.4 billion and actually labeled the company Disney Pixar, because some of the creatives at Pixar were made the creative leaders of Walt Disney Animation. In 2009, the Walt Disney Company made another acquisition, seeing the promise and the profit from Marvel Entertainment and Marvel Studios. And so they purchased Marvel Studios for $4.24 billion in 2009. And then in 2012, they purchased Lucasfilm for $4.05 billion. Now, when we look at the acquisitions, here are some of the titles and some of the big things that have happened with these major acquisitions under Disney. We talked about in 1997, Walt Disney World opened the ESPN Wide World of Sports at their Florida property. And then you can also see the Pixar full-length movies released under Disney. Cars in 2006 was actually the first movie, the theatrical release to be released under the Disney Pixar label. Marvel, the Entertainment, the first, and Marvel Studios, the first project or movie to be released was Iron Man 2 in 2010. Everything else had been released under the Paramount or Sony and other relationships. And so, and then in Star Wars, the first movie that was released after the Disney acquisition was Episode 7, The Force Awakens, and that leads up to today with a lot of the Disney Plus projects as well. So another interesting thing is looking at how these acquisitions have played a role in not just the theatrical releases or Disney Plus content, but they played a big role in the Disney parks as well. Some of the notable Pixar attractions in Disney parks: there's a Toy Story Land in Shanghai Disneyland, Hollywood Studios and Walt Disney World, and also Hong Kong Disneyland. Cars Land is in Disney's California Adventure, along with Pixar Pier. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Remy's Ratatouille Adventure, there's one in Epcot and Disneyland Paris. There's a Toy Story Mania in Hollywood Studios and Disney's California Adventure, and then there's Radiator Springs in Disney's California Adventure. What's really interesting, when Disney's California Adventure was constructed, as a lot of people know, it wasn't a very popular or well-regarded park for many reasons. And so when Bob Iger became CEO of the Walt Disney Company the first time, the decision was made that something needed to be done with Disney's California Adventure, and it needed to be revamped. And one of the ways it was going to be revamped was by turning the pier that was in California Adventure and putting more Pixar properties into that, which ultimately led to Pixar Pier, which includes the Incredicoaster and also the Toy Story Mania in Disney's California Adventure. Another thing that really helped with the revitalization of Disney's California Adventure was Cars Land. At that time, the Imagineers were planning to build a land around classic cars and around their love of cars. So when Disney purchased Pixar, and the first Cars movie came out, they started to work with Pixar in looking at how can they turn their idea or blend their idea with Cars Land, which and that's how we got where now, if you're in Disney's California Adventure, you walk into Radiator Springs, and also Radiator Springs Racers, which is an immaculate ride, a great attraction where you actually ride through Radiator Springs, and then you race around Willie's Butte, much like on a very similar track to Test Track in Epcot. Another interesting story from Pixar in the parks was when Bob Iger became CEO the first time, and he was attending an opening of a new Disney park. He watched some of the parades, and he realized that in those parades, some of the more interest or a lot of the characters involved in the parades were Pixar characters. Aside from the classic Disney characters, most of the newer characters actually came from Pixar. And so that's really what drove him to working to mend that relationship with Steve Jobs, who was the owner of Pixar at the time, because the relationship between Steve Jobs and Michael Eisner had become so fractured that Pixar actually had stated they were essentially going to become a free agent after their agreement with Disney was up, because they didn't feel like Disney was holding up their end of the bargain with the success that that Pixar projects were having. And so the relationship had become so fractured that Pixar really was thinking about walking away from the table, and Steve Jobs was thinking about walking away from the table from Disney. And so Bob Iger worked with Steve Jobs to mend that relationship. And there's a really interesting story about the iPod Plus, and including some of ABC shows like Desperate Housewives and Grey's Anatomy on the new iPod, and that kind of helped start a relationship with Steve Jobs, which ultimately led to sell or acquiring Pixar in 2006. Next, we'll talk about Marvel in the parks. And so here are some of the notable attractions and lands that Marvel has in the parks. There's an Avengers campus and Disney's California Adventure, also Disneyland Paris, and there's one being developed that should open later this year in Hong Kong Disneyland. Guardians of the Galaxy Mission Breakout is in Disney's California Adventure, and that took the place of the Twilight Zone Tower of Terror when they rethemed that. It's also now located in Disney or in Avengers Campus within California Adventure. In Epcot, the only Marvel attraction and ride to be located in Walt Disney World is Guardians of the Galaxy Cosmic Rewind. There's also Web Slingers Spider-Man Adventure, which is in Disney's California Adventure, Ant-Man and the Wasp Nano Battle in Hong Kong Disneyland, and the hotel in Disneyland Paris, which is the Disney's Hotel New York, The Art of Marvel. Now, a really, really interesting story. A lot of people ask why there aren't more Marvel attractions or Marvel characters in Florida's Walt Disney World. Well, when Marvel was trying to distribute their content and have their content distributed to the masses through movies and theme park rides and everything, early on, long before Disney purchased Marvel Entertainment and Marvel Studios, an agreement was made that east of the Mississippi River, essentially, Universal actually had the theme park rights to Marvel characters and Marvel rides, until they made substantial changes or let their kind of building lapse and these attractions lapse. So that's why in Florida, if you go to Universal's Islands of Adventure, they actually have a Marvel comic land. Now, it's really confusing because people who go see the classic Marvel characters, they don't see really the characters from or the types of characters and the representation of the characters that you would in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. But there are some characters that fall outside of that agreement, such as the Guardians of the Galaxy, which is why you see the Guardians of the Galaxy Cosmic Rewind, and they've also had a musical show in Epcot in Walt Disney World. That agreement doesn't exist anywhere else, so that's why you have an Avengers campus in Disney's California Adventure and why you have those international as well. Now, excuse me. So, of course, some of the cruise lines also have Marvel characters and Marvel attractions. That the Disney Cruise Lines famously a few years ago started Marvel Day at Sea, where the day, one of the days that you don't get off of the boat that you're sailing the whole day is actually you go and you're able to meet Marvel characters and participate in Marvel activities and shows and things like that. That can occur because those boats are outside of that jurisdiction of that agreement, because they are even though they are sailing out of Florida, which is east of the Mississippi River, they are not in the United States when they are having that Marvel Day at Sea. Essentially, they're out in the ocean. And so, will we ever see a time when Universal and Disney make an agreement so that Disney can have back those rights or buy those rights for Marvel characters to have those characters and attractions in Walt Disney World parks? We don't know, but it's also interesting, and a point that I didn't mention with the acquisition of ABC and Capital Cities is the relationship and the rivalry between the Walt Disney Company and Comcast Corporation. I think a lot of that, it goes back to the beginning of the parks. As we've talked about, Walt Disney wanted to create what he called at the time a Mickey Mouse Land, which turned into Disneyland in California. But he wanted to do that because he saw what Universal Studios was doing with their tram tours. And so those theme park companies and those theme park assets have continued to compete. Once Disneyland was open, Universal Studios added attractions and back and forth with Disneyland doing the same thing. After the purchase of ABC, that really kind of broadened Disney's reach, and Comcast saw that, and through their acquisition of Universal, then those two companies really were competing on multiple levels. Universal and Disney were competing in the theme park world, but also, or the theme park space, but also the Walt Disney Company and Comcast Corporation were competing on many, many different levels. And so you see this intense competition between Disney opening Hollywood Studios, which at that time was MGM Studios in Florida, and Universal opening Universal Studios Florida. And so, will the two companies ever work through and will there ever be an agreement for Disney to use Marvel characters in Walt Disney World parks? We don't know, but it's something that's always interesting to think about and always interesting to talk to people about and speculate. The next thing that we'll talk about is Star Wars in the parks. And so here are some of the notable attractions and lands that of Star Wars properties. So we have Star Tours. That was really one of the first, or that was really the first ride or attraction developed in Disney parks. And that really kind of paved the way for Disney, the Walt Disney Company and George Lucas to make inroads, which ultimately led to in 2012 purchasing Lucasfilm. But so Star Tours operated and then they closed down for a little bit. And now it's actually Star Tours, The Adventures Continue. And there's one of those in 4 of the parks: Hollywood Studios, Disneyland in California, Tokyo Disneyland, and also Disneyland Paris. In Disneyland, they used to operate out of Space Mountain. They used to operate Star Wars Hyperspace Mountain on a seasonal basis, and they don't anymore, but they still do out of Hong Kong Disneyland and Disneyland Paris as kind of a special package for that ride. There are Star Wars launch bays in Hollywood Studios in Florida and also Shanghai Disneyland. And these are areas where people can see some of the memorabilia from the movies and from the universe, and then also meet some of the characters and live some of the universe. In the largest expansion of Star Wars properties and IP into the parks is Star Wars Galaxy's Edge. And that opened in Disneyland and Hollywood Studios in 2019. And this is an experience where people can walk into the Star Wars universe, and they actually walk onto a planet called Batuu, and Black Spire Outpost on the planet Batuu, and they're able to in real time interact with Star Wars characters and props and have different adventures where they can be bounty hunters and they can be members of the rebellion, or they can side with the First Order. And the two ride attractions from those lands, when those lands both opened, they opened with Star Wars Millennium Falcon Smuggler's Run, which is a ride that it's a video simulator where people can pilot the Millennium Falcon on one of the runs to get material that they ultimately are going to smuggle and sell. And it is a very interactive attraction. And then about a year after, or a few, about 4 or 5 months, sorry, after Galaxy's Edge opened, Star Wars Rise of the Resistance opened. And this is the most technologically advanced attraction in a theme park right now, a lot of people say. And so Star Wars Rise of the Resistance is people actually get to go and they are part of a Star Wars story. And it's an amazing attraction. It's an amazing experience. And from the time that you actually enter the experience out of the line, just not the line itself, but once you get into the main part of the experience, it's about a 20 or 25 minute attraction experience. And so a lot of people really, really enjoy this. I've had the pleasure of having been on it. It's an amazing attraction. And then also at Disney's California, or I'm sorry, at Disney's Hollywood Studios, the first interactive hotel or stay experience was open, Star Wars Galactic Star Cruiser. And this allows people to stay in a hotel that backs up to Hollywood Studios, and they get to live for 2 nights and 2 days in the Star Wars universe. And it is real role play, depending on the decisions people make and how much people want to get into that experience, impacts their and influences what they do on that Star Cruiser, what they do in the hotel. And it's a very fun experience as well. And with all of these, there's also new attractions being planned all of the time, and there's blue sky ideas that are being planned all the time. But we will finish up talking about Disney's acquisition of Fox. In 2019, the acquisition closed, and Disney acquired Fox for $71.3 billion. Now, this price was driven up by Comcast Corporation, which Comcast Corporation made a late or last minute offer to try, and what a lot of people think and what I think, to try to push up the price on Disney, so to make Disney pay more. Another sign, as I talked about, how I research and write and talk about rivalry and competition, another sign of rivalry and competition, trying to push your competition to spend more resources for something. And there are many reasons why Comcast Corporation would want to do that. But so when Disney acquired Fox, they didn't acquire the Fox television network or the Fox News. Those stayed with the Fox Corporation. But they did acquire 20th Century Fox, which is now referred to as 20th Century Studios, the film company, and also 20th Century Fox Searchlight Film Company, which is now referred to as 20th Century Searchlight. One really important aspect of the Fox acquisition for a lot of Disney fans was the acquisition of the Fox-owned Marvel properties, such as the X-Men and the Fantastic Four, which we are starting to see being introduced into the MCU within the Walt Disney Company and within Marvel Studios. And there's a lot of speculation as to, when those characters will actually be introduced into the MCU. There is a Fantastic Four movie that is in development. And there's also speculation as to when contracts run out. I believe in 2024 is when, or the end of 2023, beginning of 2024 is when maybe we'll actually start to be able to have Marvel and the MCU use X-Men name. They've called people mutants so far. We've had a few appearances in movies and in shows. In Black Widow, there was a very brief encounter with someone named Ursa Major, who they didn't call a mutant, but in the comics is a mutant. But more recently, Xavier, Professor X, has been in one of the MCU movies, and Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness. And then at the end of Miss Marvel, it was revealed, she's some type of mutant. So we're starting to see that being included and introduced into the MCU a little bit at a time. Something that's really interesting, another thing that's really interesting that happened from the Fox acquisition was Disney gaining controlling stake in Hulu. So when Netflix first launched on the scene, they were the original disruptor in looking at how people consume content. And so several theatrical studios got together, and they coordinated to create a platform that was more friendly toward the studios and also could compete with Netflix. The resulting platform was Hulu. And so that was controlled primarily by Disney, Comcast Corporation, and the Fox Corporation. So when Disney acquired Fox, they acquired Hulu, Fox's stake in Hulu as well. And so because they controlled the majority of Hulu, Comcast actually came to an agreement with Disney that Disney has the controlling stake in Hulu. So basically, Disney can make the decisions as to what is on Hulu. But there's a very important caveat in 2024, Comcast can make Disney, or Disney can make Comcast sell, but Comcast can make Disney buy their remaining stake in Hulu. And so that's been something that's really been interesting for Disney, is what happens with Hulu. As with Disney Plus, what we've seen internationally outside of the United States is the inclusion or the launch of Star in several markets. And Star is essentially, the way I've explained it in class a few times, it is a lot like Hulu, without the Hulu brand, and it's actually included as a sixth tile in the Disney Plus platform. And so once Disney has complete control over Hulu, will they do something similar? Will they would they get rid of Hulu and actually turn everything into Star in the United States? Or does Hulu have enough brand cachet, enough memory with consumers, that they would actually keep Hulu and just bring Hulu under Disney Plus with that banner? And that being said, if they did that, would they actually bring in ESPN Plus as well? So you might have 7 tiles under the Disney Plus banner, instead of the 5 that you have right now. And so within television, Disney also acquired Fox's television library and FX and FXX, and National Geographic. What this acquisition did for Disney is it brought more international exposure. It brought more mediums for Disney to include on Disney Plus and to include in their programming, to include in their parks. And so we are just starting to see the beginning of this acquisition, and the outcomes of this acquisition. We're just starting to see that in a lot of the Walt Disney Company products and content and the parks experiences. So it'll be really interesting to see where all of this goes. Now, I also said I wanted to discuss the potential or the rumors that maybe Disney would at some point sell off ESPN or parts of ESPN and ABC. And what's really interesting right now is when streaming really, when a lot of companies started getting into streaming, which was about the time of that the pandemic started in 2020. A lot of the metrics that people use to measure success in streaming was really just subscribers. Well, now investors are in Wall Street and investment bankers and stock markets are wanting to see companies making a profit off of their streaming services, which brings up a really interesting question: is what is the place of live sports entertainment on these streaming services? And we've written about this and we've talked about this before, but when live sports does bring in, and sports programming does bring in a lot of viewership. And one reason why ESPN was so important to Disney, and still is now, is actually ESPN had an agreement that ESPN is included in every cable package that somebody uses or that somebody purchases. So if somebody is paying monthly for a cable subscription, they're paying for ESPN regardless if they watch it or not. And it was a premium charge, is one of the highest charges that cable subscribers and these companies the distributors had to agree to. And so that brought in a lot of revenue for the Walt Disney Company, as I said, and that was, they were able to distribute that through parks and through other content creation, but also the rights agreements to showcase live sports entertainment have grown, and they continue to grow, and they are very, very large numbers. And so in an environment where now profit needs to be shown from streaming services, how much appetite do consumers, especially consumers or customers who don't watch sport or don't consume any sport property, how much appetite do they have for live sports entertainment being included on streaming services? That'll be a really, really interesting question, because as these companies, once they start including content on their streaming services and they start including those in their their agreements with professional leagues, and the National Basketball League is the next big league to be negotiating their media rights. So we'll see what happens with that in the coming year. But as companies start to pay more for the rights to broadcast and include live sports entertainment, and they're including them on their streaming services, well, that cost will more than likely be passed on to somewhere. It'll more likely be passed on to consumers. So is it going to be an add-on cost, kind of like ESPN Plus is now? Is it going to be something that everybody pays for it, and following the traditional linear television or cable television model? Because that will be something that's really, really interesting, because a large portion of consumers really don't have interest in sport. And so, as I said, how much appetite do they have to pay more for their streaming subscription? So that will it include sport if they ultimately aren't going to consume it? That being said, a lot of experts have said, and I tend to believe this as well, that if you are the Walt Disney Company, it really wouldn't be worth, at least at this time, to sell off a property like ESPN, because it does seem like there needs to be some type of balance. But it seems like live sports entertainment does have a future on streaming services, and if it has that future, and depending what that future is, ESPN is one of the largest, or the largest, media companies in sports entertainment. And it has, arguably the biggest cachet, the biggest brand recall for consumers. And so if the Walt Disney Company were to sell off ESPN, and then want to include live sports entertainment on their platforms and on the streaming platform, and then they ultimately would be paying someone else to include that, for the rights to include that on their streaming networks. Whereas right now they have ESPN as a property, and it's not bringing in as much money from traditional cable or linear television as it used to year over year, but it still does bring in a lot. And so right now, I don't think you would see the Walt Disney Company selling off parts of ESPN, or even ESPN and ABC. And so another thing that I want to close on is are there future acquisitions that the Walt Disney Company can make? Everybody knows that Bob Iger is back as CEO, at least for 2 years minimum. We'll see if that's extended. And his mark on the company was really expanding the company through the acquisition of different properties. And so will we continue to see that? And if we continue to see that, what are some of the properties that maybe they would want to purchase? I mean, there are a lot of rumors and people speculating as to, different things that they would want to purchase. Would they ever want to purchase a gaming system? Because that's one area that the Walt Disney Company sort of lags behind other competitors in, is the gaming, the electronic gaming experience. What about live sports gambling? What about things like that? Would they ever want to purchase another studio? Possibly. People have even thrown out something like Netflix. Would that happen? On the flip side of that is, and Bob Iger fielded a question about this during his town hall meeting at the end of 2022. Would an agreement ever be made between the Walt Disney Company and Apple to merge those two companies? Because when we talk about revenue, and we talk about what the companies are worth, the Walt Disney Company pales in comparison to what Apple is worth. And so since we're talking about acquisitions, these are really, really interesting questions to keep an eye on in the future. And if anything ever happens, to come back and bring more discussion back with these. And so thank you very much for this. I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you found it entertaining, informational. And please, ask questions or give your comments, your suggestions on things. And have a great rest of your day. Thank you. Bye.